Hello everyone, it is Joe here from Omnipoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCGO codes, including the stuff from Evolving Skies, make sure you go ahead and check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your order using that code Omnipoke. For today's Fusion Strike decklist, we are going to be talking about Genesect Toxtricity. Genesect is obviously one of the strongest cards from the Fusion Strike set, so today we're going to see how he fares as a main attacker here, using Toxtricity to improve our damage output. And that's because Toxtricity is a stackable HP debuff for VMAX Pokemon. That means the more Toxtricity we have in play, the less hit points VMAXs have, and that puts us into range of one-hit KOs with Genesect, thanks to the likes of Power Tablets. So we're going to try and keep our entire board as Fusion Strikers, as is necessary for Toxtricity, and then we can be doing really good numbers and getting uptrades. That's a very simple premise for the deck, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Look at the likes of Suicune Ludicolo, where they're trying to do a very similar approach, and that's being one of the most successful decks in the game currently. So Genesect being a different coat of paint, but with the same objective, seems pretty reasonable here, especially when you see that Genesect is not only our draw engine, but also our main attacker all in one package. It means that we can create some big swing turns thanks to the draw power of Genesect throughout the game. Let's have a look at the Pokemon then, and as always, when you are leaning into Fusion Strike system, you want to be as bare bones as possible so that you can insta-play everything and draw as much as you can with this ability. It allows you to draw cards until you have as many cards in hand as you have Fusion Strike Pokemon in play, so everything you see here has that Fusion Strike tag, so we can draw as many cards as possible with our Genesects. The objective usually is to get multiple Toxel, multiple Genesect into play here. Because that Technoblast dealing 210 is the attack that we lean into for 2 metal and 1 colorless, which is nice, a small upgrade compared to Zacian, for example, with a very similar attack here. And like I said, we have the bonus of Power Tablets scaling this damage even further, which is going to combine with the ability from Toxtricity, which says that you reduce 30 hit points of VMAXs when this Toxtricity is in play, and that is, like I said, stackable, so if you get 2, 3 Toxtricity, you are really hindering the hit points of a VMAX to allow you to get big one-hit KOs. That's why you see a thick 4-3 line of Tox here. I don't play the 4th Toxtricity because it can end up clogging the hand, especially in the opening turns. But for Toxel here, pretty mandatory. We want to see them as quickly as possible, get them developed nice and early so we can draw more from Genesect, and so we are threatening those Toxtricity. And then we are playing 1 copy of Mew V. It gives us a critical mass of 9 Pokemon, which I think is actually pretty important, so we never miss out on cards from Fusion Strike system, even into the late game when we've suffered KOs, potentially on multiple Pokemon because there are a lot of sniping decks in the format, but also Mew here is just a free retreater, and that allows us to pivot in and out of our Technoblast that little bit easier, even if we are coming up against decks that have, for example, Tool Scrapper or Tool Jammer. We can have something with natural freedom of retreat, which is great, so we're not super reliant on those air balloons. Onto the trainers then, and we are going to try and pad out the deck with as many of these as possible, because we are looking to have as much insta-play as we can to make the most out of our Genesect's draw engine. We are playing 1 Evo Incense instead of that 4th copy of Toxtricity because it gives us the same amount of outs, but it also means we can Peony into this card, and it means that it's an insta-play even in the late game, whereas the Toxtricity isn't necessarily always the case. Energy Search is actually a 2 of here because I find it super important when we have the high energy attack cost with Genesect to never miss a manual attachment, but of course it means that we have extra access in the opening turns for discard fodder with the likes of Quick Ball, with the likes of Peony, so we can then make our sources as live as possible. So really like this card, especially with that Peony combo where you will oftentimes look to go for things like E-Search Quick Ball in the opening steps to then give yourself an easy discard of metal, as well as search for more Genesects to start drawing as many cards as possible. Then we have 3 copies of Switch alongside these air balloons and the shopping center that you can see. I think this should be easily enough for us to move in and out of our Genesects at will. 4 Power Tablets to help us get over opposing Toughness Cape 2 prizes, as well as help us get through VMAXs with the help of Toxtricity. The sources are going to be our main means of acceleration. We also have Raihan and Exp.Share in the deck though, so these are super important to activate, and like I said, we have Quick Ball for discard, we have Peony for discard here, so we should have lots of ways to get metal into that bin as quickly as possible to start powering up our Genesects for hopefully turn 2 attacks. Quick Ball for getting our Pokemon out is pretty self-explanatory. Then we have the mini shopping center package in the form of 1 Exp.Share, which we can hopefully pick up and move around onto multiple Genesects to maintain a stream of attackers quite easily here. A couple copies of Cape, which is really nice into the likes of the single strike matchup, where you force them into VMAX that little bit more often because you have that higher range of hit points. Also into Suicune, you can force extra outs from them. So this is a really nice deal here. Even can protect you in strange situations against things like Dragapult, seeing as though you can put these onto Toxels and whatnot on the opening stages, and then Shopping Center them away once you've evolved into Toxtricity, which is really nice. So quite a few cute things you can do with the Cape of Toughness to change the math for the opponent. It makes you that little bit safer against Mew as well. When they are the player going first, they can be threatening that turn 2 boss KO, which can be backbreaking here. And although we're only forcing one additional tablet, it's still an extra out that they need to hit. So it gives you a small defense here and there, and could even put people off using the boss's orders play if they have the boss but not the tablet. Sometimes it's a risk for them to boss up the Cape and then miss the tablet, for example. So it can make the opponent play quite differently, even if they have those outs. And then the air balloons give us extra pivoting. We don't always want to put the Mew into play. It's a bit of a safety net, really, whereas Balloon can often quite happily find itself onto other Genesects and other Toxtricities throughout the game. We play 2 copies of Stormy Mountains because it can get extra Toxels out into play early. That's obviously good for developing these ASAP, so we're drawing more cards with Genesect, and it means we can then be threatening those Toxtricities from as early as turn 2. The Crystal Cave is nice here from some additional healing, again, helping out against things like Dragapult and Jolteon, trying to set up damage over your Pokemon. Can also be helpful against Rapid Strike Urshifu as well, so this is pretty decent. We don't actually have the Fusion Strike energies in this deck. We're just going to rely on basic energies as well as captures here, so we cannot defend against Inteleon, so the Cave is actually a really important means of offsetting their damage here and there. And like I said, the Shopping Center allows us to get tricky with our tools. It means we can throw them down onto the board without much of a headache, knowing that we can eventually Shopping Center to rearrange these tools in a more appropriate way. It means we can get multiple uses of the 1 Exp.Share. Means if we are taking hits from Cape, we can then pick up the Cape if need be in certain instances, or move the balloon around, those sorts of things. So yeah, Shopping Center, versatile as a one-of. The reason why we play so many different stadiums, by the way, is because you always want to be able to bounce your own stadium if need be, so that you don't clog your hand with the same stadium over and over again. For example, if I played the Stormy Mountains and my entire deck was Stormy Mountains and my opponent didn't bounce my stadium, any other Stormy Mountains that I draw become dead cards. That's why we play 3 individual stadiums to hopefully mitigate that as much as possible. Onto the supporters then. Like I said, I'm not playing a Lesser Sparkle. We're actually leading into the Raihan here instead. Ultimately, because I think Metal Saucer is the best acceleration we can take advantage of anyway. Having just overall more basic energy makes more sense here than trying to split between captures, the Fusion Strike energy, and the metals here. So having a higher count of basic metal just opens up this Raihan option that little bit easier, where we can cherry pick extra cards from the deck. So we get that acceleration to maintain our Genesects, but we are also cherry picking the likes of Power Tablet, the likes of Metal Saucer, switch cards, those sorts of things, so we can be as safe as possible. And I really like this extra tutor effect, similar to how we use Peony in a lot of instances, so we can cherry pick some combos out of the deck, which is a really nice option to have. Yes, they are dead in the opening stages, but we are only playing 2 copies, and a Lesser Sparkle can find itself equally as dead in the late game if you've already used one, for example, or if you've prized some or just drawn into some naturally via your Fusion Strike system. So Sparkle is intuitively probably one of the better cards, and I have tested both builds at this point, and I'm slightly preferring the Raihan, but I could see arguments for both. Then we're playing 3 copies of our other supporters. You never really want a super high supporter count because they end up clogging the hand that little bit too much, but I think both Marnie and Peony have big merits as being early game consistency cards. Marnie can, of course, shuffle cards to the bottom of the deck, and this can actually be pretty important for protecting pieces like your Power Tablets, like your Toxtricities, for the later stages in the game when you go for big one-hit KO pushes, for example. So this is a great option. It also can disrupt hands away from, turn 2 bossing your Genesect and that sort of thing, so it's a defensive option that we can have here for disrupting. The Peony, great for picking out specific pieces, not too bad in the early game, gives us extra outs to not just lose to Path of the Peak early on as well, which is always pretty important for us. And then Boss is pretty self-explanatory to gust up things when need be. Onto the energy then, 2 copies of Capture and 8 copies of Metal Energy. Like I said, you want to see almost too many metals in the opening stages because then you open up your quick balls, you open up your peonies to give you easy discard to then open up all of your sources to be playable instantly, which is great. And because the Genesects have 1 colorless in their attack cost, you can get away with having a couple copies of Capture here, which gives us extra outs into getting early Toxels down, extra Genesects down if you want to draw additional cards that turn. So all around a really nice card to have in the Fusion Strike decks. Here is the list then. Pause now if you'd like, but we will be moving on to some tech options here. Oricorio is actually an interesting one. If you can develop it early enough alongside a Cape, you give yourself a much better defense against Mew decks, and I think it may end up becoming important enough, but it's something that I haven't tested enough to know for certain. I think because Mew has such low inherent hit points, I think naturally we can make a comeback in that instance just by having multiple Genesects and Toxtricities and whatnot developed. But the Oricorio would force more out of the opponent, but I think naturally you'd have to have a pretty good draw to develop Oricorio early enough. And in general, you want your board space to be more Genesects and more Toxtricities regardless, I think, for the most part. So certainly one I have my eye on, and if the breakpoints are important enough in certain matchups, I can foresee it sneaking in. VIP Pass, especially combined with Cramomatic, is another potential route for this deck where you try and go aggressively. But I think naturally, because you're looking to hold things like Power Tablets, hold things like Toxtricity for turn 2 anyway, you don't actually go zooming off with this deck too often. So I don't really like the extra clunk that these cards can sometimes offer if you don't hit them in the opening stages. And at the same time, we have Stormy Mountain, we have a couple captures, we still have a good amount of search for our Pokemon. Chili Sun and Crest, similar deal here. We want to keep as few supporters in our deck as possible, so we're motoring through with our trainers. I've already given my speech about a lesser Sparkle. The one things I will note is that Fusion Energy is important for protecting against Inteleon pings, can give you a better time against things like Dragapult, Jolteon, Urshifu, those sorts of things. So if they are huge decks in the game, I can foresee Sparkle making its way back in instead of Raihan. But like I said, I want to have as high amount of basic energy as possible to allow our sources to be the majority of our acceleration. It means we can lean into that Exp.Share that little bit better as well. So that's where I'm leaning right now, but I can certainly foresee Fusion Strike energy being strong enough because, again, it can protect against things like Umbreon as well, which is potentially a big deal. Then for some more trainers at the top here, Pokegear, never a bad option. Rotom Phone has synergy as well with Genesect. It's a -1, and you can cherry pick a card as well that can either be, again, an insta-play or a piece that you're specifically looking for. And Cramomatic is a coin flip card, but it can allow you to have some optimal turns, which is pretty cool. And in this list, I'm not playing Cross Switcher. Again, it's mostly because of the cards that you're holding back in hand already. It's not quite as streamlined as Mew, where you can have that threat of turn 2 boss KO quite as much. You're usually looking for your own sources, your own activations for sources as well in those opening stages. So you're much less easily going to be able to gust KO turn 2. You're looking to KO active a lot more often on your turn 2. So I think Cross Switch is one of these cards that is better served in the Mew deck because it's lower maintenance overall, whereas we hold a few more pieces in the opening stages. So yeah, that's why we're just sticking with switches and bosses for the most part right now. Onto the matchup overview, I think some of the things that I'm kind of more afraid of, really. Urshifu VMAX seems like a bit of an issue. They can obviously rapid flow through your Toxtricity. They only have 120 hit points apiece, so the rapid flows can then put them out of 1-hit KO range quite often, which then makes us, just a 2-shot deck, and they have so much spread that it can be a bit of an issue for us. The one thing I will say is that you do have capes to try and make it difficult for them and force multiple quick shootings, so should still be a decent back and forth, but turning off your Toxtricities can also hurt your draw in some instances as well, which I think is a bit of an issue. Suicune as well, I think potentially a balanced matchup, but ultimately I think they should find it easier to chain Suicune than we find it chaining Genesects. We're both playing capes, but they have Ludicolo for one-shots, we have Power Tablets for one-shots, those sorts of things. I think it should overall be quite balanced. If it's Suicune Ice Rider, I feel a lot more confident in the matchup though, so just something to bear in mind. I think the single strike matchup should be way better than the Mew, actually, and I think it should be relatively favorable because naturally Houndoom is damaging these VMAXs, which means we really don't need many cards to get these big one-hit KO uptrades. And when we play our Cape of Toughnesses, we actually force the VMAXs in a lot of instances where the Umbreon and the Gengar's base damage output just isn't enough to get through us, which I think is important. Dragapult and Jolteon I don't think are that bad. Against Dragapult, like I said, you can cape up your Toxels and try and buff them out that little bit so they stay on board early, so you can get some big one-hit KOs. And I think Jolteon just has such a low threshold of damage that you don't even need Toxtricity to be in play to get one-hit KOs on those sorts of Pokemon, so you can play around the healing that little bit more. Against Mew, I think it can be dicey. I mean, we have the Cape to try and buff us out and at least force things like tablets turn by turn and allow them to miss in certain instances. And you know, their hit points is only 310, so it's not a terrible threshold for us to try and reach with the Genesect. But overall, I think it should be a pretty balanced matchup overall. I find it like slightly negative, but not bad enough to say it's like a really bad matchup overall. On to the closing thoughts. I think this deck is going to feel very rags or riches. You're going to have games where it feels like the absolute nuts because you drew the right things in the right order. You're able to discard your energies, then find your sources, then start popping off, evolving into your Toxtricities. Then there'll be hands where you're just sitting with Toxes, sitting with tablets that you can't play, only have manual attachment. You'll pass into the opponent and they'll have gust options, and you have to start rebuilding all over again, and it will feel quite awkward. It really is going to be some big power spike turns that really feels oppressive. Then there'll be those turns where you just get clogged up and you don't do too much. And I think it's going to feel a lot worse than the Mew builds overall, because even when Mew's drawing poorly, it needs less to actually get going and get working, whereas the Genesect feels more wombo combo. When it comes off, it feels crazy and you have huge wins and spike turns. But I think there are times where it just comes in the wrong order and then you're not even drawing cards with Genesect at all. You're just having to pass into the opponent, which never feels too great. Yes, you have things like Raihan that can like push you back into good stead after receiving KOs and whatnot, and that can like sort of clear the hand at times. But there'll be times where, like I said, it's just not coming in the right order, and that can be an issue for a deck like this. The one thing I will say, though, is that if Mew becomes targeted heavily enough, this could be a good option to continue to play Genesect and Fusion Strike, because I think you have a far stronger single strike matchup than the Mew build does. Mew basically just relies on pure tempo, gust affecting, that sort of thing against the single strike matchup, be it targeting their Houndours if they've missed attachments, or targeting down their 2-prize Pokemon that they're manually attaching to, so you can get those trades in on their 2 prizes in the opening stages. But if you're the player going second as Mew, you feel pretty unfavored into single strike. Whereas the Gentox, I think, always has a chance because you're mostly 2 prizes, even though you're allowing Gengar to do a huge amount of damage. They're damaging themselves with Houndoom. You have your Toxtricities that they basically have to ignore for their prize trade, and that just means that you can get those big 1-hit KO responses on their 3 prizes, which is never too bad. So yeah, interesting positioning for Genesect in the format. Let me know what you think about the list. Were you expecting a lesser Sparkle to come in? Were you expecting cross switchers? How have you been building Gentox? Do you even think there's a chance that Toxtricity can make it into the Mew builds? I'll hear it all down below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in another Fusion Strike video tomorrow. Cheers.